Morning, everybody, and delighted to welcome you to this webinar being hosted by us at Dhruva Advisors, where we intend to talk to you for the next about 1 hour about certain current developments on listing and reorganization, two broad themes. And Really, the purpose of the call today was to talk to you about recent developments, changes which are happening. Mehul, if it go to the first slide, Mehul. So the agenda for the Mehul, you need to go to the first slide. So the agenda for the discussions today is that we have seen a frenzy in the stock markets over the last 1 year and last 6 months in particular. We have stock index scaling new heights virtually every week, and you lose track of where are we. At one point of time, we were talking about 55, and sure enough, we are now talking about 62,000 as the Sensex, and that's quite interesting. Very rarely have we seen the markets move up at the pace at which it is going. More important, we have seen IPOs, and we have seen IPOs by the dozen. Virtually every other day, you have new IPOs coming, etc. And more than the IPOs coming, we are looking at billion-dollar IPOs. Earlier, for a company to float a billion-dollar IPO was something which was unheard of. Today, we have several of the billion-dollar IPOs. We have seen unicorns mushroom. Again, we are losing track. The other day we were talking about a dozen, and now we are talking about 30s and almost 35 new unicorns emerging, which is of course a very welcome sign. Shows how the entrepreneurship is growing in this country. And then we have SPAC, the first and the most famous SPAC being that of Renew Energy, a company which sort of flipped its structure, went headquartered overseas, merged into a UK company, and the UK company got listed in USA with a multi-billion-dollar valuation. And suddenly, while the frenzy of SPACs has died down a little bit, you are seeing a great amount of interest, and we see so many inquiries really very regularly as to what is it that one can do to externalize one's shareholding and list overseas. We have wealth generated by several people, not merely from the valuations in the stock exchange, but also on account of ESOPs, and every new ESOP throws up so many people earning millions of dollars again. And when you do an IPO or you do a SPAC, probably a right time to really relook at your entire structure, reorganize, look at succession planning. And in this segment, we are going to talk about all of these issues. My colleague Vaibhav is going to deal with all of these issues, take to you to say, how do we approach an IPO from a more holistic perspective? How do we look at what are the things that you need to do before you launch an IPO? And then, as I mentioned, one of the things which we see ever so happen frequently is that people reorganize themselves prior to an IPO. And reorganization has posed its own challenges in the recent past. We saw, for example, some of the changes that were brought about in the last budget, and not only in the budget, but by the time the finance bill became a finance act, and you now have a situation where not only are slump exchanges taxable, not only is goodwill not allowable as a deduction, but you also have slump sales being taxed in a particular manner, which has changed the entire paradigm of what you need to do in terms of restructuring. There are so many avenues which were earlier regarded as avenues for reorganization, which are no longer available today. And then we have certain case laws which have come over and over again, which change the basic tenets of what we thought was an accepted norm. So, for example, what was our understanding about appointed date, suddenly we have a case law which throws it all apart. Will this case law survive the test of time? That remains to be seen. Only future will tell us that, but certainly we need to be aware and alive to the challenges that are posed in the recent past on any restructuring that we need to do. and my colleague Mehul will be talking about this segment. What we do hope at the end of this 1 hour with you is to really take you through the current developments, the challenges. And after that 1 hour, of course, we'll be open to a question and answer should you have anything. And if time doesn't permit, you are free to write to us, email to us, and we're very, very happy to respond to you. So with that background, if I can turn over to you, Vaibhav, and you can talk about what you are talking about, the IPO restructuring and everything related to that. Vaibhav, over to you.
Thank you, Dinesh. Good morning, friends. So capital markets have clearly been on fire, driving a rush towards IPOs, both in India as well as overseas. Preparation for an IPO clearly requires a lot of planning. Indeed, one needs to be comfortable with the fact that one will be in the public eye ever so often post-listing, which requires a lot of putting our house in order. And that brings us to a pertinent aspect around the steps that one needs to take before an IPO to clean up, to remove inefficiencies, to enhance value, and to create a robust long-term structure. Which brings us to the first point on our discussion today around the need for pre-IPO restructuring. And Mehul, if you could take us to the next slide. So one of the pertinent aspects around the pre-IPO restructuring steps is how is the holding structure around the shares of the company that needs to be listed. And this becomes important more in the case of offer for sale, where if we are intending to do an offer for sale, then how does one really look at repatriating out the sales proceeds to the individual shareholders? And if there are corporates which are owning the shares in the operating company today, then repatriating the sale proceeds which are generated by these corporate shareholders as part of the offer for sale entails another repatriation taxes in the form of dividends. And how does one really need to look at it and clean it up if required? Another aspect is around consolidation of value. Ever so often we see that in family-run businesses which are unlisted, businesses are typically owned across various entities. And more importantly, the intangibles and the IPR which are associated with the business, they are very commonly owned in separate entities and in some cases also individually by the promoters. And how does one really consolidate that entire value pre-IPO so as to be able to get the right IPO pricing for our business? At the same time, in a lot of cases, you will see that you have non-core businesses and non-core assets which are not supposed to be part of the business which is to be listed because the market will not pay us a value for it. And how do you then hive off those non-core assets? There have been changes on how one looks at slump sale from a taxation perspective, and hence, the mode of doing this hive off becomes very critical. Another important aspect that comes up very often in promoter and family-run businesses is that we see a lot of businesses which are owned in non-corporate entities, whether these are partnership firms or LLPs or non-corporate structures like these. And in addition to these non-corporate structures, there are also transactions that are there between these entities and the main entity which is proposed to be listed. And how does one clean up, corporatize these non-corporate structures and bring them within the fold of the operating business becomes an exercise which is important. Last but not the least and very critical is succession planning, something which Dinesh alluded to, is on how does the promoter family look at creating long-term family trust structures. And the question that ever so often comes up is that should we be creating these structures before listing, or should we wait for the listing to happen and then create these structures? And of course, one needs to keep in mind the various considerations that will come up after we do a listing. You have the SEBI takeover regulations to look at, and how does one really look at creating structures post-listing, taking SEBI approvals, and should we hence look at creating these structures before listing and avoiding all the complications around the SEBI regulations. So we'll just discuss through this through a couple of case studies that we have put on the slides. This case study, if you look at it, this is around a corporate holding structure where you've got a BCO which is proposed to be listed, and the shares of this company are owned by another holding company called A. And some of these shares are proposed to be sold under the offer for sale route as part of the IPO. Now, if you just look at the tax implications of this structure, and assuming that the shares were to be sold at a price of 100 in an IPO, after paying the long-term capital gains taxes on the offer for sale, the proceeds that come to ACO, they have to be repatriated to the individual shareholders. And for that repatriation, you suffer an additional dividend of 35.88%. And hence, if you look at it, you only get 58 out of a sale proceeds of 100 in the hands of the promoters, which really means an effective tax rate of almost 42%. Whereas if you were to eliminate this holding company from the structure, and if the shares were directly owned by individuals, then the net proceeds in the hands of the individuals is 90, a vastly different result just by realigning the holding structure. Now, a question that comes up is that how does one look at removing ACO from the structure? And also, so one of the ways to do this could be that we can simply fold back A and B by way of a merger, which is a tax neutral process, and by virtue of which shares directly will get issued to the individual shareholders. Now, as far as a merger is concerned, as we all are aware, a merger requires an approval from the NCLT, the National Company Law Tribunal. And that is a legal process which takes at the bare minimum 6 months. So one really needs to evaluate this in light of the time that we have to the IPO, and whether we have the ability to afford that 6 months period, which possibly brings us to an important point on the need to start early, the need to look at what we need to clean up, do the pre-IPO steps, the need to start that early on. Moving on from there, the second case study here is, and this we were faced in a real life experiences. So you had a company which runs a business, a manufacturing business X, which is on the left under BICO. And a lot of the IPRs underlying this business were owned in a separate company, ACO, and some of the IPRs were also owned directly individually by the promoter. From a listing perspective, it becomes important that these IPRs and intangibles are part of BICO for the right valuations to emerge. And while ACO can be merged into BICO through a tax neutral process, from an individual promoter perspective who owned these IPRs, one of the things that we examined in this case was how can we use the tax neutral process of succession of the IPRs by an individual from his proprietary ownership into a corporate ownership, and then how do we then look at consolidating this corporate into BICO through again a tax neutral process. One of the things that emerged in this case was that while a succession of a proprietary concern into a company structure is exempt under law from capital gains, but that exemption comes with a condition that the company so converted needs to be it needs to continue to be in existence for a period of 5 years. And hence, if you were to merge the company immediately after the succession into BICO, how does one comply with that condition? And in light of that, can one look at a demerger in place of a merger to consolidate these IPRs into the operating company? And these are things which emerge, and this is something that we implemented in a structure like this. Moving on from there on, hive off of non-core businesses. Here again, we were faced with a situation where there was a company which ran a manufacturing business and also a packaging business, which was in that sense more a business which was captive hence so far, but there were plans to do third-party packaging activities as well. And before IPO, there was a requirement to move this business out, move the packaging business out and list the manufacturing business. Now, moving a packaging business, hiving off a business, how does one do it? A slump sale or a demerger are two obvious choices that come to mind. But in a pre-IPO scenario, both slump sale and demerger need to be evaluated in terms of their relative pros and cons. While a demerger is by its very nature tax neutral and there's a tax exemption which is provided, but it entails time in terms of an NCLT scheme. On the other hand, a slump sale, while not being tax neutral, it is faster and less time consuming. And in a case, and in this case specifically, we had got long-term capital tax losses in this BPO. So a slump sale emerged to be a more tax efficient option, and also particularly because of the fact that it was faster. We could just complete a slump sale over a 6 to 8 weeks timeline. Moving on from there, again another example where there was a partnership firm which acted as a distributor of the business which was carried on in the operating company which was supposed to be listed. And one of the things that emerged apart from wanting to corporatize this entire distribution function was the entire aspect around related party transactions. So while in an unlisted scenario, related party transactions while have to be disclosed in your as part of your accounting, but post-listing related party transactions are scrutinized even further from a public shareholder perspective. And one of the things that we did here really was, how does one corporatize the partnership firm and then consolidate the entire distribution business back into the manufacturing company so that the entire value is consolidated in ACO, which can be listed. The last case study on this slide is on succession planning. Again, a very pertinent point on how and when does one look at creating family trusts for our shares which are owned in the company. Should we look at doing them before an IPO? Should we do post IPO? And while one can do a family trust structure post an IPO, but that would require taking a specific approval from the Securities and Exchange Board of India for exemption from the requirement to make an open offer. Whereas if we were to do this structuring before listing, then we can look at settling the shares into the trust without a SEBI approval. This comes with us with a few considerations that are important. Is that from a SEBI regulation perspective, if there are any shares which are to be sold under an offer for sale, they come with the requirement of having a holding period which is unchanged for a period of 1 year before the listing. And hence, for any shares which are to be sold under the offer for sale, one can really not put a family trust structure in this 1 year period before the IPO. And secondly, the minimum promoter contribution that is required as part of the IPO under the current regulations, again, that requires a 1 year holding period. So the point that I'm trying to make here is that for any succession planning exercise, one needs to start planning that early. We have this 1 year requirement for offer for sale and minimum promoter contribution to be kept in mind. And hence, if we can plan this before the 1 year, then it becomes all the more efficient. So just to look at what are the takeaways in terms of the pre-IPO things that we've spoken thus far. One is, how do we look at our holding structures, review our holding structures and reduce the tax inefficiencies, particularly in corporate structures where we are looking to do an offer for sale? How does one transfer the IPRs in a manner which is tax efficient, in which we can consolidate value? And also, how can we look at taking the fair value basis of IPRs to reinstate the fair value in our books, and then that creates a tax advantage? While goodwill, depreciation on goodwill has been taken off from the tax laws, but any other intangible assets that we can create as part of a merger exercise, we can claim a tax benefit on it. Segregating the non-core, and how does one look at slump sale versus a demerger, relative pros and cons, tax as well as non-tax, becomes a very fact-based exercise. Related party transactions, as we saw, under a post-listing scenario, get scrutinized looking at public shareholders' point of view, and how does one clean up those related party transactions, look at doing, again, using the tax neutral modes of mergers, demergers to remove these related party transactions becomes an important exercise. And lastly, succession planning and family trust structures in a pre-listing scenario, avoiding all the complications of SEBI open offer regulations post-listing, disclosing the family trust as a promoter group and taking benefit of the 3-year holding period requirement is an exercise that one needs to carefully consider. The next important aspect is around taxability of shares that we offer under the offer for sale route, stock splits and bonuses. And for shares under the offer for sale route, there is a very interesting dilemma that the tax law offers. So as we all know, capital gains tax exemption on listed shares was taken off in the 2018 budget, wherein the government had introduced a grandfathering provision for shares which were listed, and the share price of January 31, 2018 was made available as a cost for any sale of shares that happened thereafter. Similarly, the tax law as it stands today has provisions around computation and determination of the cost of acquisition of shares which were unlisted as of January 31, 2018, but get subsequently listed and transferred out. And the way that formula works is that higher of your actual cost of acquisition or the fair market value is available as your cost of acquisition. And then there is a definition of fair market value which is provided in the section, which for shares which were unlisted as of January 31, 2018, but get subsequently listed and transferred out, is taken to be the indexed cost of acquisition until the end of financial year 2017-18. Very interestingly, the shares which are offered under the offer for sale route are considered as unlisted shares because at the time of transfer, they have not been listed yet. And hence the definition of fair market value, which covers unlisted shares, but shares listed at the time of transfer, doesn't apply to these shares. Now that brings us to a very interesting view, which we've tried to explain through an example on this slide. A share which was unlisted and is being sold under the offer for sale route at a sale consideration of 200, which had an original cost of acquisition of 10 rupees and an indexed cost till FY18 of 20, and a fair market value as per a valuation report as of January 2018 of 100. Now, if you were to look at how a taxability view could emerge on this share at the time of an OFS, is one view could be that we simply take the original cost of acquisition as the cost, which is 10 rupees, and that gives us capital gains tax of about 19 rupees. Another view that can be really taken is that because the definition of fair market value does not cover this scenario, can we really rely on the general definition of fair market value and look at substituting the cost by the actual fair market value of January 31, 2018, which was 100. And if you look at it, the results are vastly different. You've got, on one hand, you've got a tax of 19 if you were to take an original cost. On the other hand, just by substituting the actual fair market value of January 2018, the tax reduces to 10. And while there are no precedents here because this is a law which has come in 2 years ago, what really becomes important is that there is a technical basis around being able to take the fair market value of January 2018, but it becomes important to formulate the right strategy around taking this view so as to be able to mitigate the risks on interest and penalty exposures in the future. Now we come on to stock split and bonuses, again, things which are used very commonly in an IPO scenario from a capital structure perspective and also from an IPO pricing perspective. And when it comes to stock split, while the tax law is quite clear on the cost of acquisition of shares which are split, there's this section which says that the cost of acquisition of split shares will be calculated with reference to the original shares pursuant to which these shares were split. And hence what it really means is that the split shares cost of acquisition will be deemed to be the original cost of acquisition. When it comes to period of holding, while the tax law is silent on the period of holding, there are judicial precedents basis which we can take a view that just a subdivision of shares does not lead to a separate taxable event, and hence the period of holding of the original shares which have been split should be available as the period of holding for all the shares. What becomes important is that while under domestic tax law, there is no impact of a stock split really. What happens if there are non-resident shareholders who've got shares which are grandfathered under the tax treaties? And while the grandfathering provision takes us to shares acquired prior to April 1, 2017, your Mauritius and Singapore tax treaties. But if there is a stock split which happens today, can one take a view that the shares were acquired post April 1, 2017 and grandfathering is not available? Again, no clear answers, but a view that can really be taken, and there are precedents and judgments which favor this view, is that if the domestic tax law itself exempts the period of holding, why should the tax treaty be read more stringently? Moving on from there to bonuses is, again, the tax law here is more clear in terms of the fact that a bonus issuance is a specific event that is in the present, and hence the cost of acquisition of shares is taken to be nil, and the period of holding is also taken to be from the date from which the bonus is allotted. Again, there are precedents around Section 56, where Section 56 is not applicable on a bonus share issuance, and hence a bonus share issuance, at least from an event perspective, is a tax neutral event. We move on now to ESOPs, which again is very important from a listed company perspective. And one of the questions that ever so often comes up is that what should be the period and the time of exercise of the ESOPs by the employees? Should the exercise happen before IPO? Should the exercise happen at the time of the IPO? What is the right strategy? And in a lot of cases, this strategy is governed more by the need to provide liquidity to the employees to shore up their taxes. Because as we all are aware, taxes on ESOPs trigger at the time they are exercised basis the fair market value on the date of exercise. Now, and Mehul, if you could move on to the next slide, through an example, we have tried to explain here as to how exercise before an IPO or an exercise at the time of an IPO, what is the tax result and what could be the optimization opportunities here. So if you look at an exercise of an ESOP before an IPO, where let's say the fair market value of the share at the time of the exercise is 100 and the exercise price is 10, which results in a perquisite value of 90 and a perquisite tax at the full rate of tax of 38. And if these shares were subsequently listed at a price of 150, and the employee sells the shares at 150 immediately on listing and gets the 100 rupees on which he has already paid taxes as a perquisite, as his cost as an offset, the delta of 50 becomes short-term capital gains for him. And because it is a listed share, the tax rate that applies on this short-term capital gains is 15%, which plus surcharge comes to almost 18%. So, whereas if you look at an exercise at the time of an IPO, where 150 becomes the fair market value for the purpose of calculation of the perquisite value, the employee will end up paying a perquisite tax on the entire delta between 150 and his exercise price of 10. Just to compare the effective tax rate between the two options, the results are significantly different. And hence, so again, we were dealing with a company very recently, a client where we were looking at what is the right strategy for an ESOP exercise, and this is something that that's an analysis that is very useful for a decision like this. Moving on from there, we move on to overseas and SPACs. Again, a very interesting concept, and as Dinesh spoke, we've got the first SPAC in India, which is the Renew Energy SPAC, and we had the opportunity to work on some of the elements of this transaction. SPAC by its very nature is nothing but a blank check company which is already listed, and it is formed with a view to acquire an operating business or acquire an operating company. SPACs have emerged as a very good alternative to a full initial public offer exercise because it of course reduces the entire timelines of a listing. At the same time, it also provides certainty because because funds are already raised and available in this company. And just in terms of process, after funds are raised, the SPAC has got a timeline typically of 18 to 24 months to really acquire a target company. And the ways, the mode in which the acquisition is done usually is in the form of a merger of this operating company with the SPAC, whereby as part of the merger, the operating business gets listed. And in an Indian context, if you were to look at it, it necessitates that an Indian company needs to have an overseas holding company. And if you could move to the next slide. Yeah, thank you. So from an Indian perspective, it is necessary that an Indian company needs to have a overseas holding company, which can then be merged into a SPAC and get listed. So from a structure which is on the left-hand side, an Indian company which has a business and it may have an overseas subsidiary, the target structure to move for a SPAC listing to happen is for the shares of the Indian company to be swapped into shares of an overseas holding company. And while the structure looks relatively simpler on paper, there are a whole host of tax and regulatory considerations that become important here to analyze and look at. And Mehul, if you can take us to the next slide. So some of the important tax and regulatory considerations here really are around how do we swap the shares of the Indian company to the overseas holding company in a tax neutral manner. While a simple swap of shares is a taxable transaction at the time of the swap basis, the fair market value of the shares of the overseas holding company that you get. How can we look at mergers and demergers as ways to achieve this swap? Again, for non-resident shareholders, one needs to look at treaty grandfathering issues. One needs to look at how does one preserve the cost and the period of acquisition of shares under a swap model, as well as for resident shareholders, because they don't have any treaty benefit. How do we make it tax efficient for them? So one of the ways that we've recently done in a real life case is we've achieved a flip of the structure for the purpose of a SPAC by way of a merger, wherein we merged the Indian operating company into a new company owned by the overseas holdco, and the merger itself was a tax neutral exercise. In another case, we used a merger wherein instead of doing a merger, we demerged business from the current Indian company into the new Indian company. And as part of the demerger, we got the overseas parent company to issue shares to all the shareholders of the Indian company. And that really achieves the entire swap in a tax neutral manner. Again, another important aspect that needs to be planned from a tax perspective here is post the flip, how does one deal with indirect transfers? And as we all know, if there is an overseas company whose shares are transferred, and if that overseas company contributes substantial value or derives substantial value from India, then a transfer of shares of this overseas holding company will be considered to be taxable in India. And hence, it becomes imperative for a SPAC, for a flip of the structure to happen, to be able to make this entire concept of indirect transfer efficient. And that brings us to a point on how does one look at the operating model of the Indian company? how does one look at IPRs, and whether one needs to really realign the entire operating structure and transfer the IPR so that the value of India is not substantial in the overall value chain. From a regulatory perspective, again, there are important aspects around how does one look at round tripping for Indian resident shareholders for them to be able to own shares of the overseas company, which in turn will own shares of the Indian company. While so far the current Indian FEMA regulations have restrictions on round tripping, and RBI has been approving round trip structures on a very case-to-case basis, the draft of the new ODI regulations seek to liberalize some of these restrictions. There are again aspects around how does one migrate ESOPs from the Indian company to the overseas company? How does one look at LRS? While so far view that LRS regulations, the monetary limits under LRS, that seems to be plugged in the new ODI regulations, which are currently in the draft stage. So all in all, for a overseas SPAC listing to happen, there are aspects which need to be planned around flipping the structure, both tax aspects as well as regulatory aspects, which are very, very critical. With this, I will now invite my colleague Mehul to take us through some of the developments from a restructuring perspective. Thank you.
Thanks, Weber. I'm just trying to move the slides. Just give me a minute. Just give me a minute.
Should I try?
Is it okay now? Can you see the screen?
Yes, it's visible.
Yeah. Is this the right slide? Yeah. Thank you. Sorry for this bit of a technology issue. Moving on from what Weber spoke about on IPOs, internal restructuring has been happening quite a bit, especially in the last 20 years. And there's a lot of reorganization activities, slump sales, demergers, mergers. What has given it fillip is obviously the economic, the surge in the economy, etc., the growth, but a lot of evolution of the tax laws. So, for example, the slump sale law or the slump sale definition was only introduced, in the early 2000s. The demerger was introduced in 1999. So the law has evolved. A lot of provisions have come, like, taxing shares for issue less than market value, etc. And the law has kept on evolving, and we professionals have to keep pace with the law. What has also happened, which was not happening earlier, and tax professionals like us used to have to evolve positions for various issues under demerger, merger, slump sale, how these conditions are satisfied, what is the position to be taken. Now, case laws have been evolving. So that's the good part. So some of the positions that we have taken have been confirmed. A few may have been contrary to what positions we have taken, and some interesting new developments, some interesting new positions taken by taxpayers and confirmed by the tribunal. So let's just jump and deep dive into these latest developments, whether it's in terms of the law or in terms of the case law. We have always been asked this question that my company has business losses. They are brought forward business losses, losses made in the past. Currently, the company is profit making, and now there is an opportunity to sell some assets out and divest the non-core assets, etc., and make some gain, or maybe transfer an intangible to another related company or whatever like that. And there will obviously be, when you transfer some assets, hard assets like machinery, intangibles, there will be capital gains. Now the law provides that brought forward business losses cannot be set off against capital gains. And the understanding is that it can be set off only against business income, which sort of leads us to an interesting. Dinesh, you are on. If you can keep yourself on mute. Yeah, thank you. So, which leads us to this question that can brought forward business losses be set off against profits which arise out of any capital gain type of items. Let me put it that way. Now, it is therefore interesting to read the operative provision of this law. What it states is that carried forward business losses under the head profit and gains of business or profession shall be set off against the profits and gains, if any, of any business or profession carried on by him and assessable for that assessment year. So what it really means is that while this is trying to say that business losses can be offset against business profits only, brought forward business losses against business profits only, it doesn't mean that just because something is deemed to be capital gains. So for example, if you sell certain plant and machinery and that is deemed to be short-term capital gains, doesn't mean that that is not a profit from a business activity. And it is definitely a profit from a business activity. And because of the language of this section, you can offset that profit, which is characterized as short-term capital gain, against the brought forward business losses. Now, this proposition has been supported by various judicial precedents, including the Delhi and Bombay High Court. And therefore, it becomes quite interesting to review this proposition wherever it is applicable. Now, one question that arises is that if I'm selling an entire business unit under a slump sale, can this benefit be taken? The answer seems to be a gray area, because when you are selling a business undertaking, can you say this is profits arising out of the business when you are selling the business itself? So that's something which still needs to be evaluated, but this is a very interesting proposition. The second optimization opportunity, which again we are asked several times and clients face this. Take this example of an Indian company engaged in the textile business, and for the purpose of expansion, it has invested abroad in overseas subsidiaries. Let's say it has invested 100 crores. And now, because of the recession and COVID and all of that, it has suffered huge losses in the foreign country. Now, the problem is that the losses in those foreign country obviously cannot be offset against profits in the home country. Because, unless you do a cross-border merger or whatever, the losses pertain to that jurisdiction stay in that jurisdiction. Therefore, one proposition that we were thinking of is that what if you do a capital reduction, meaning in the overseas jurisdiction, there is a reduction of capital, and whatever funds that company has may be repatriated to the Indian company. But basically, through this capital reduction process, you realize the loss in the Indian company, because Indian company, when it receives the consideration, has also given up its part of its shareholding in the overseas company. Again, the same problem that usually such a capital reduction is treated as a capital loss, and therefore it is only offsettable against capital gains and not against business income. But the proposition that we are trying to say is that when I make an investment in an overseas company in the same line of business or similar line of business, I'm not making that investment for capital appreciation or for earning dividend. I'm making the investment for expansion, for setting up supply chains, for manufacturing units. In an IT company, it could be for marketing or for getting overseas customers. And it is entirely linked and related to the business operations in India. The investment was made as a measure of commercial expediency and for business purposes. And therefore, can you say that the loss that gets crystallized on capital reduction is actually a business loss and therefore can be offset against business income? Again, this proposition has been supported by favorable decisions. And again, something which you need to keep in mind. If you have overseas operations which are loss-making, can you utilize this opportunity and offset? Of course, one has to keep GAR in mind, and unless there is, you have to ensure that there is a commercial and a business rationale for this capital reduction. For example, the operations have died down, the monies are lying there without any use, etc., and therefore you need to do a capital reduction and bring it back. Some of those things can be thought through. Next, we move on to some of the recent developments, as I said, both in terms of the actual changes in the provisions in the Act as well as in case laws. So most of you must be aware of the goodwill amendment, and we thought that that has been discussed quite a bit and we don't need to cover it here. But there was another amendment which was made in the last Finance Act, which was done, it did not come in the finance bill, but came later, was this entire taxation of slump sale. So what they have done is they have amended the law to say two things. One is the transfer of a business undertaking by any means, whether a sale or otherwise, shall be considered as a slump sale. That's one. And secondly, they have put in provisions where there is a minimum sort of consideration that will be subject to tax, a minimum deemed consideration. So there is a deeming fiction which says that a fair market value of the undertaking should be your minimum consideration for the computation of capital gains under slump sale. Now, again, this is fairly similar to what most of you are aware around Section 56, where there is a deeming fiction for consideration on sale of shares, property, etc. This is very similar. What they have provided is that the assets and liabilities comprising in the undertaking, some of these assets like immovable property or shares or securities will be substituted by its fair market value as they have prescribed, and which is similar to your Section 56 provisions. And that will be then computed as your consideration. So if you have assets of 100, liabilities of 30, then your consideration will be 70, except that the value of assets may not be 100, it may be higher, because the immovable properties and the shares which are comprised there could be, their fair market could be higher. So your 100 could become 120, 130, and then your 130 minus 70 of liability, so 60 would be your deemed consideration. So that's how they have put it across. Now, again, they have said that if you receive shares as consideration for the slump sale, then again, there is a similar mechanism to compute what could be the consideration. The other important point to note, and this is more in the past, but again, for people who have missed this, these amendments are applicable from FY 2021. So any slump sale done even from after 1st April 20 in the financial year 2021, these provisions apply. So while these provisions were introduced in 21, they apply for the financial year 2021, which is unusual, but in a sense retrospective. But yes, that they have done. So what are the key pointers here? So slump exchange, which means that you sell a business for shares, securities, and not really cash, that becomes taxable. There were a few judgments which actually said that that is not taxable, incorrect in our view. But now the government has also sort of brought in to say that these are taxable. The most significant effect of this amendment is that companies where we are trying to reorganize their businesses, put some of the businesses into a subsidiary, whether for a private equity or whether for getting funding separately, maybe loans, or maybe for an IPO. And this is quite common, where people put in businesses into a subsidiary so that they can do various things. That has become more difficult because now there is a deeming fiction to calculate consideration. Earlier, one could just transfer it at their book value or tax value and minimize the taxes. That is an important thing, and one needs to see how to optimize taxes in that scenario. The other interesting thing is that, let's say there is a stressed business and there is actually a transaction with a third party where the true commercial value does not necessarily reflect the value which is computed as per tax. And then what do you do? Because you have agreed to transfer it at, let's say, 100, but the FMV as per tax is 120. Then unfortunately, the seller gets only 100, but gets taxed at 120. So that's another area which becomes a problem. Moving on from there, we also now have a decision which is interesting and again a bit technical, but again very important in a restructuring scenario. So there is a provision called 5627B, essentially providing for taxation of excess premium, and this was mainly to plug people who were putting in their unaccounted money into the companies and making it account and basically whitewashing it by putting in excess premium for any issue of shares. So to plug that planning or that kind of tax evasion, this was introduced. But very interestingly, in a genuine merger scenario, there were a few interpretations being done that if you are merging a company and issuing shares as consideration, which is what you usually do, and if the shares as consideration are, let's say, not of enough value corresponding to the business which is being merged or demerged, then can someone say that you have issued the shares for excess consideration, and the excess consideration is really the business which is being merged or demerged, the fair value of that business. Now, obviously, this seemed to be like a stretched interpretation. And if you see in this example, A Limited merging into B Limited, B Limited issues shares at par, not at premium, but because the language of the section is such that it says consideration over and above the fair market value, can somebody say the fair market value of the shares is less, the consideration is higher because you have taken over a valuable business, and therefore 5627B provisions. Now, these are very, very, while the interpretation seems stretched, the consequences are very hard, because if such a scenario happens, then the difference could be taxed at the full, sort of marginal tax rate, which is now 25%, but earlier it was 30-35% in the case of a company. So that represents a very heavy consequence in a merger, and people were really worried whether in such a scenario they could go ahead with doing that merger. Luckily, now there is a decision which clearly says that the intent of section 5627B was to tax excess premium. There was no intent to tax something which is in a restructuring. So what they basically said is the provisions only contemplate issue of shares by company on its own and not towards discharge of any consideration or due to obligation pursuant to amalgamation. So it is not as if the shares are issued for consideration. What is happening is you are merging, and so shares are issued as consideration, but for the merger, but the provisions only contemplate in their view, in the tribunal's view, provisions only contemplate a scenario where there is excess premium, share premium, which is obviously has to be in a scenario where shares are issued for cash consideration. So there are various other arguments given by the tribunal, including the fact that the amalgamation is always a tripartite arrangement between the shareholders, the merging company, and the amalgamated company. And while these provisions 56 to 7B, etc., are more deeming provisions, they are more relevant in a bilateral scenario between a potential sort of shareholder and a company, and not really in this kind of a tripartite situation. So very welcome judgment, and hopefully it should resolve any of those issues or fears that people had while doing restructuring. There is one more interesting judgment, and this seems to be, somewhat, in our view, a bit misplaced. So let's talk about this in detail. A Private Limited was holding shares of B Limited, 26%, and B Limited was planned to be amalgamated into A Limited. Now, A Private Limited increased its shareholding from 26 to 100% during the financial year 2013-14, and more specifically on 10th February 2014. Now, the companies filed a scheme of amalgamation of B Limited into A Limited on 14th February 2014, which means after the acquisition of the remaining 74% stake. So when the scheme was filed, B Limited was a 100% subsidiary of A Private Limited. And therefore, obviously, because A Private Limited cannot issue shares to itself, no shares were issued as part of the amalgamation scheme. There was no consideration. The scheme was sanctioned in April of 2014. The key thing here was that the appointed date of the scheme was kept as 1st April 2013. The other key fact to note here was that B Limited had substantial amount of brought forward business losses, which were sought to be obviously merged or migrated to A Private Limited on the merger. The tribunal took a view that to qualify as an amalgamation, 75% of the shares have to be held. 75% of the shares have to be issued. Sorry, let me rephrase that. Shares have to be issued to 75% of the shareholders of the amalgamating company, obviously other than the amalgamated company itself, in this case, A Limited. So if A Limited is holding something in B Limited, for that portion, you don't need to issue any shares. Tribunal held that for purpose of determining this condition, the appointed date is crucial, and therefore the position as on the appointed date has to be seen. Now, in this scenario, the position on the appointed date was 74% of the shares were still held by somebody else. Now, in the scheme, obviously no shares were issued to that shareholder, because that shareholder, that 74% shareholder, no longer remained as on once the scheme became effective. So when you issue shares under the merger scheme after the scheme becomes effective, there was that shareholder was not present. And therefore, how do you issue shares to them? But the tribunal is saying that no, technically you require to issue shares to the shareholder as on the appointed date. Otherwise, we will disregard this, disregard the losses being migrated to A Private Limited. Again, this was a very short decision, maybe 2-3 pages. There was no detailed reasoning given by the tribunal for this conclusion. The key other points were that there was no discussion on the Supreme Court decision in case of Marshall and Sons. Now, Marshall and Sons is where the appointed date concept was blessed, meaning to say, Marshall Sons says that if you have an appointed date in the scheme, then the profits and losses of the amalgamating company become those of the amalgamated company from the appointed date. Now, nowhere does the Marshall and Sons decision talk that the shareholders who have to be issued shares have to be shareholders as on the appointed. So, but unfortunately, there was no discussion on what the Supreme Court held in Marsh & Sons in this decision. And the other interesting thing which the tribunal missed, but it could have been discussed, is that when there was a shareholding change in the middle of the year, did Section 79, which provides for change of shareholding of closely held companies, was that triggered or not triggered, or whether the merger provisions under Section 72A override this section? So that, again, that discussion was not there. So one has to keep a watch out for similar kind of decisions, though this could be a stray decision, and therefore one can look at something like this, may not really be too much of a worry, especially for a listed company. So in a listed company, shareholding changes every day. So does it mean that when you do a merger with a listed company, you cannot have a retrospective appointed date? I mean, there are too many questions that arise from this decision, and one has to keep a watch out for that. Last thing which I will discuss before closing. Again, this is a very topical thing. As you are aware, and as Weber also spoke about the 31st Jan 2018 grandfathering benefit. Now that gives that when you sell shares on the market today, if your share price as on 31st January 2013, you get it as a cost. Now, let's look at this example where both A Limited and B Limited are listed. B Limited merges into A Limited currently in the current year. And both were listed as on 31st Jan 2018. Let's assume that the cost of acquisition of shares of B Limited is rupees 50 for a set of shareholders, but the 31st January 2018 price is 200. While we have spoken about a merger in this scenario, even in a demerger, these provisions do apply. So what happens? The issue really is that when I get shares of A Limited, do I take the cost as 50 rupees or do I take the cost as 100 rupees? The problem is that while there are obviously provisions which say that cost of acquisition of the shares of amalgamating company become the cost of the shares of the amalgamated company which you get. Period of holding is also flows, so your earlier period of holding is also counted. Tax neutrality is maintained that way, but there is no specific mention of a similar provision being there for the grandfathering benefit. Now, if you read these provisions, while there is no specific clarity on this, if you look at the case laws on amalgamation, etc., that how they talk about tax neutrality and that period of holding also flows from the beginning when you held shares of the merging company, cost of acquisition of the previous owner is available. Even indexation flows from when you actually held the shares. All of that, there were some fair market value imputation provisions as on April 1, 2001. Again, there is a case law which says that even in a merger, you can go back to April 1, 2001 fair market value of the amalgamating company. Looking at all of this, a view seems to be emerging that you should get the grandfathered price benefit in this scenario. Again, no legal precedents on this specific question, no case laws, because this has been introduced only in 2018. Hopefully, we should see some case laws emerging soon. Demerger, again, as I said, similar, but there it becomes a bit more difficult because in an amalgamation, the amalgamating company goes out of existence, and therefore you have a lot of ground to say that if I, my grandfather price, if that 200 rupees price I don't get, then it's lost forever. But in a demerger, the demerged company continues to be listed, and therefore that argument that my grandfather price is lost forever does not apply. So then the question is that how do you look at a demerger? What happens? So there are two possibilities. Because in a demerger, the provisions say that your cost of acquisition of the shares of the demerged company, which continues to exist, and the new shares of the resulting company you get, the cost of acquisition has to be divided between those two in the ratio of net assets. So one question is that, can you say that the old company continues to have 200 rupees as the cost, which is the grandfather price because it was listed on 31st Jan 2018, and the new shares, one view could be that it is zero. The other view could be that no, sorry, 50 rupees is what is the original cost, and I will take proportionate of that 50 rupees and apply it to the new shares. And the third view could be that no, the logical interpretation or how you give effect to what the government intended is to divide 200 rupees, which is the grandfathered price, in the ratio of net worth between the two shares. The jury is out on this, and a lot of representations have been made to the government as well, as we understand, to clarify this. Hopefully something could come, but if something doesn't come, then obviously you will have case laws which will evolve and which will give guidance on this. With this, coming to the end of this presentation, any questions is very welcome. Thank you.
I think Mehul, Vaibhav, we are over the time, and it might be a good idea to get emails from those who have participated and sort of happy to answer questions. As you know, over the last 1 hour, we have tried to sort of bring about issues on the table which are contemporaneous, where one needs to think about, where one needs to plan about. And I do hope that has added value to whatever you are seeking to do. These are interesting times. There are new challenges come up, as Mehul was talking, whether it is about appointed date, whether we are talking about grandfathering, or the possibility of externalizing a company and doing a SPAC, as Vaibhav was explaining. I do hope that whatever we have discussed with you today has added value to what you would like to do. And we'll be very happy to answer any questions that you may have. If any of you would like to have a copy of this presentation, feel free to write to us. I'll be happy to share a copy. Thank you all so much. Thank you, Vaibhav. Thank you, Mehul, for the brilliant presentation today. And thank you all for participating. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.